I wasn't supposed to be at that wedding. I was supposed to be invisible. The woman who cleaned the floors, folded the linens, and never asked questions. But 3 days later, I walked into a room full of billionaires. On the arm of the man they were all afraid of. They didn't know my name. They didn't know where I came from, all they knew was this. I wasn't supposed to be there. What they didn't know was that I wasn't standing beside him because I loved him. I was standing there because someone needed to send a warning. And I was the message. I thought it would end after one night. I was wrong, because the moment I stepped into that wedding, I stopped being a background character and became the reason everything started to fall apart. The sky above New York that afternoon was heavy and overcast, a dull gray pressing down on the city as if it carried a warning. Inside the upper levels of the Blackwood residence, the silence felt deliberate, almost calculated. Lena stood alone in the service corridor, her hands folded neatly against the front of her uniform, waiting. She had learned quickly that waiting was part of the job. For the past 5 months, she had worked under Nathaniel Blackwood, a name that appeared regularly in financial headlines and elite society columns. To the outside world, Nathaniel Blackwood was a self-made billionaire, the ruthless head of Blackwood Capital, known for acquisitions that reshaped entire industries. Inside the mansion, he was something else entirely, precise, controlled, and emotionally distant. To Lena, he was simply Mr. Blackwood. Her employer. Unreachable. Unreadable. She moved through his world quietly, polishing marble floors, arranging silverware beneath imported chandeliers, never speaking unless spoken to. No mistakes. No opinions. No presence. That was how she survived. But that afternoon, something felt off. The house was too quiet. The staff avoided eye contact. Conversations stopped the moment Lena entered a room. Whispers floated through the kitchen earlier, fragments she hadn't meant to hear. The wedding is this weekend. His ex-fiancée. The media will be everywhere. Lena tried to push the thoughts aside. She had enough problems of her own. Her rent was overdue. Her mother's hospital bills sat folded inside her drawer, unopened but impossible to ignore. One wrong step here, and she could lose the only job keeping her afloat. Then a door clicked shut behind her. Lena. Her name, spoken calmly, but with unmistakable authority. She turned. Nathaniel stood a few feet away, perfectly composed in a tailored suit. The warm light from the wall sconces framed him sharply, highlighting his controlled posture, his straight tie, his unreadable expression, except for his eyes. There was something restless there. Something unresolved. Yes, Mr. Blackwood, she asked softly. He studied her for a moment, as though weighing a decision that had already been made long before this conversation. I need you to attend a wedding with me, he said. Lena blinked. Surely she had misheard. A wedding, sir? Yes. His tone didn't change. This Saturday. The hallway seemed to narrow around her. As staff, she asked carefully. To assist at the event? No. A pause. Not as staff. Her heartbeat thudded loudly in her ears. You will attend as my guest. The words landed with quiet force. Her mind scrambled for logic that didn't exist. Her, a maid, standing beside a man like him at a high-profile society wedding? Surrounded by people who lived in a world she had only ever seen through magazines left on coffee tables? I don't understand, she said honestly, lowering her gaze. Why me? His jaw tightened for a brief second, the only sign of emotion he allowed. I need someone who won't become part of their performance, he said. Someone outside their circles. Someone who doesn't care about their games. Lena swallowed. And you believe that's me? There was a pause. Because I trust you, he said quietly. Those words unsettled her more than anything else he could have said. Before she could respond, he added, think of it as a temporary arrangement. A role. Clear boundaries. She nodded slowly, even though her pulse refused to calm. If that is what you require, sir, she said, I'll go. Nathaniel gave a single, precise nod. Good. Preparations will be made. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the marble corridor like both a promise and a warning. Lena remained where she stood, breath unsteady. She had no idea that saying yes would change everything. And she had no idea what kind of storm would unfold when she stepped into that wedding at his side. I didn't sleep that night. No matter how many times I told myself it was just a role, my mind refused to settle. A wedding. His ex-fiancée's wedding. The kind of event people like me only saw in magazines or from behind serving trays. EY morning, the house was already in motion. 2 women I'd never met arrived before breakfast. One introduced herself as a stylist. The other barely spoke, already circling me like I was a project instead of a person. They didn't ask what I wanted. They told me what would work. Stand straight, one said. Look forward, not down, the other added. No nervous hands. I wanted to laugh. Nervous was the only thing I felt. By noon, my reflection no longer looked like the woman who scrubbed marble floors for a living. The dress was simple but unmistakably expensive. The heels unfamiliar. My hair styled in a way I'd never learned how to recreate. I didn't recognize myself. When Nathaniel saw me, he stopped walking. Just for a second. You look appropriate, he said finally. Appropriate. Not beautiful. Not stunning. Still, his eyes lingered longer than necessary. The drive to the venue was silent. The city blurred past the tinted windows as if I were leaving one life behind and borrowing another. When we arrived, I understood immediately why he had chosen me. Every face that turned toward us carried the same reaction, surprise. Then confusion. Then calculation. This wasn't what they expected. I felt it the moment we stepped inside. Whispers followed us like a ripple across the room. People pretended not to stare, failing badly. A woman in a pale blue gown approached us, her smile sharp enough to cut. Nathaniel, she said warmly. I didn't know you'd remarried. I didn't, he replied calmly. This is Lena. No title. No explanation. Her gaze slid to me, slow and assessing. Interesting choice. I returned her smile, steadying my breath. Thank you. She blinked, clearly not expecting that. Across the room, I saw her, the bride. She was exactly what I'd imagined, polished, radiant, surrounded by attention. When her eyes met Nathaniel's, something dark flashed across her face before she masked it with grace. She walked toward us. This is unexpected, she said softly, her eyes never leaving mine. You didn't mention bringing someone. I didn't think it was relevant, Nathaniel answered. Her smile tightened. And you are? I met her gaze. Someone who knows when to show up. Silence stretched for half a heartbeat too long. Nathaniel placed his hand lightly at the small of my back. The gesture was subtle. Protective. Possessive. And that was when I realized something dangerous. This wasn't just about attending a wedding. This was about sending a message. And whether I liked it or not, I was now part of it. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. I stood beside Nathaniel, hands folded, posture steady, doing exactly what I'd been brought here to do, exist without apologizing. But the reception was different. That was where people stopped pretending. I felt it before I heard it. The subtle shift in tone. The way conversations grew louder as we passed, as if daring me to notice. A woman at a nearby table laughed just a little too loudly. Some people really know how to climb, she said, her eyes flicking in my direction. Nathaniel stiffened beside me, but I shook my head slightly. Let them talk. Then a man approached us with a glass of champagne, his smile polished and empty. So, he said casually, how did you two meet? Nathaniel answered before I could. Through work. The man turned to me. Interesting. And what line of work is that? There it was. The question designed to shrink me. I met his gaze. The kind that teaches you how to observe people who think they're untouchable. The smile slipped. A few nearby conversations went quiet. Nathaniel's hand tightened briefly around mine. Later, during dinner, the bride herself made her move. She stopped at our table, lifting her glass. I have to say, she said sweetly, you're very brave. Coming here. I returned her smile. I was invited. A pause. You must feel out of place, she continued. These circles can be difficult to navigate. Only if you're trying to belong, I replied. I'm just visiting. The table fell silent. Her eyes hardened, but she raised her glass anyway. Well. Enjoy the evening. When she walked away, my knees finally started to shake and Nathaniel leaned closer. You handled that well. I wasn't trying to, I said quietly. I was just tired of being underestimated. He studied me then, not as an obligation, not as a convenience. As a woman who could stand on her own. That was when I understood something important. They weren't uncomfortable because I didn't belong. They were uncomfortable because I didn't care whether I did. And that made me dangerous. The ride back from the wedding was quiet. Not the comfortable kind. Nathaniel stared out the window, jaw tight, fingers resting motionless on his knee. The city lights slid past us, reflected faintly in the glass like something distant and unreachable, broke the silence first. You didn't bring me there just to make an appearance, I said. He didn't deny it. I needed them to see you, he replied evenly. To think what? I asked. That you'd moved on? That I wasn't alone, he said. I turned to face him fully. That's not the same thing. He met my gaze. For a moment, the carefully constructed calm cracked. They underestimate anything they can't classify, he said. You disrupt their expectations. And that makes me useful, I finished for him. A pause. Yes. The honesty stung more than a lie would have. So this was strategy, I said quietly. Not coincidence. It was necessary, he replied. I wouldn't have involved you if I thought you'd be hurt. But you didn't ask, I said. Silence. Back at the house, I didn't follow him inside immediately. I stood in the driveway, heels sinking slightly into the gravel, the night air cool against my skin. I need to know something, I said. Is this over? Nathaniel hesitated. Just long enough. No, he admitted. Not yet. My chest tightened. They're watching now, he continued. And they won't stop. Not after tonight. I laughed softly. So I don't just get to walk away. You could, he said. But it wouldn't be simple. I looked at him then, really looked. The man who controlled rooms without raising his voice. Who moved people like pieces. Who had just pulled me into a game I hadn't agreed to play. If I stay, I said slowly, it's on my terms. He nodded. Name them. No lies, I said. No surprises. And I don't exist just to make a point. He considered that. Agreed. I turned toward the house, heart heavy but steady. I didn't know how long this arrangement would last. But I knew one thing for certain. If they thought I was a pawn, they had underestimated me. The first message arrived 3 days later. No greeting. No signature. You're closer to him than you should be. I stared at my phone for a long moment before locking the screen. Nathaniel was in meetings all day. I knew that. His schedule was always precise, layered with obligations I wasn't meant to see. For the first time since the wedding, I realized something unsettling. They weren't watching him. They were watching me. The second message came that evening. Careful who you trust. Some doors don't reopen. I didn't respond. Instead, I started paying attention. The car that slowed too long outside the gate. The unfamiliar face at the cafe across the street. The way conversations stopped when I entered certain rooms. This wasn't paranoia. This was pressure. That night, when Nathaniel finally returned, I showed him the messages without a word. His expression hardened instantly. They crossed a line, he said. They already had, I replied. They just didn't think I'd notice. He paced the room once, then stopped in front of me. I can increase security, he said. Limit where you go. Who you see. And turn me into proof that I matter, I said quietly. That's what they want. He looked at me sharply. You're not expendable. I held his gaze. Then stopped treating me like something that needs to be hidden. Silence stretched between us. Finally, he exhaled. What do you suggest? That was the moment everything shifted. They're testing me, I said. To see if I'll retreat. If I'll panic. And if you don't? Then they'll have to change tactics, I answered. Which means mistakes. Nathaniel studied me, something like respect flickering behind his eyes. You're adapting faster than I expected, he said. I've had practice, I replied. People underestimate women like me all the time. The next morning, I did something deliberate. I went out alone. No disguise. No secrecy. No apology. I walked into the world they thought they could scare me out of, and somewhere out there. They realized I wasn't backing down. It happened in broad daylight. I had just stepped out of a small bookstore 2 blocks from the house when a voice stopped me. Lena. Not loud. Not rushed. Confident. I turned slowly. The man stood near the curb, dressed casually, hands in his coat pockets as if we were old acquaintances. I recognized him immediately. He'd been at the wedding. One of the quiet ones. You shouldn't be here alone, he said calmly. That's not your concern, I replied. He smiled. Everything connected to Nathaniel is our concern. People walked past us, unaware. The city kept moving, indifferent to the tension coiling in my chest. This doesn't have to become unpleasant, he continued. You were brought into something temporary. You can leave the same way. And if I don't? I asked, his gaze hardened just enough to matter. Then things around you will start to fall apart, he said. Careers. Finances. Accidents that don't look like accidents. I felt fear then, real fear. But beneath it was something steadier. Anger. You think threatening me will make me disappear? I said. That's lazy. His smile faded. You don't understand how this works, he said. I understand perfectly, I replied. You only threaten people you can't control. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Tell whoever sent you this, I added, I'm not the weakness they're hoping for. I walked away before my legs could betray me. That night, I told Nathaniel everything. He listened without interrupting, his expression darkening with every word. They've never approached anyone this close to me before, he said. Then congratulations, I replied. You've made history. He looked at me sharply. This isn't a joke. I know, I said. That's why I'm not leaving. Silence settled between us. You could still walk away, he said. I wouldn't stop you. I shook my head. If I leave now, they learn exactly how to win. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded once. Then we stop playing defense, he said. Something in his voice had changed. So what's next? I asked. His eyes met mine, steady and unyielding. We make them nervous. And in that moment, I knew. There was no going back. The first move didn't come from Nathaniel. It came from me. The morning after the warning, I requested access to his schedule, not the public one, but the version marked restricted. The meetings that never appeared on calendars. The names that were never written down. He didn't question why. He just handed me the tablet. "Tell me what you see," he said. I scanned the entries slowly. Patterns emerged where none were supposed to exist. Repeated intermediaries. Shell organizations that appeared briefly, then vanished. Familiar surnames circling the same decisions. "They're not united," I said finally. "They're competing." Nathaniel's eyes sharpened. "Explain." "They're pressuring me because they don't trust each other," I continued. "If one side thinks I matter, the others panic." A pause. "So we let them," he said. That afternoon, I attended a charity luncheon I'd previously been excluded from. No announcement. No explanation, just my name printed neatly beside his. I felt the shift immediately. People watched. People whispered. Phones appeared, then disappeared. I spoke carefully. Listened more than I talked. Asked questions that seemed harmless, but landed precisely where they needed to. By the end of the event, 3 different versions of the same rumor were already circulating. That night, the messages returned. But the tone had changed. "We should talk. There's been a misunderstanding. Perhaps we started off on the wrong foot." Nathaniel read them and smiled faintly. "They're recalculating," he said. "For the first time," I replied. A week later, one of the men who'd threatened me quietly resigned from a board position. Another postponed a merger indefinitely. No reasons given. No explanations owed. Power doesn't collapse loudly. It retreats. One evening, as we stood in the study reviewing reports, Nathaniel looked at me with something like awe. "You realize," he said, "they're more afraid of you than they are of me." I met his gaze. "That's because I don't follow their rules." For the first time since this began, I felt steady. Not protected, prepared. They had tried to scare me into silence. Instead, they taught me where the leverage was. And now, I knew exactly where to press. It didn't stay quiet for long. The first article appeared on a Monday morning. Not an accusation. Not a scandal. Just questions. Who was Nathaniel Blackwood's mysterious companion? Why had she appeared so suddenly, and everywhere? By noon, the story had been rewritten 3 times. Each version softer than the last, but the intent was clear. They wanted me exposed. At the next industry gathering, I felt it immediately. The room watched me in a way it hadn't before. Not curiosity, measurement. A man I didn't recognize stepped into my path. "You should step back," he said calmly. "Before this becomes damaging." "To whom?" I asked. He smiled thinly. "Everyone." Later that evening, my phone buzzed again. A settlement could be arranged. That was when I understood. They weren't trying to destroy me. They were trying to buy me. I handed the phone to Nathaniel. "They think I have a price," I said. His expression darkened. "Do you?" I shook my head. "But now we know theirs." The next move was deliberate. At a private summit, one usually closed to outsiders, I took a seat beside Nathaniel without explanation. The silence was immediate. Every conversation in the room recalibrated. I spoke once. Just once. "I don't represent anyone here," I said evenly. "I'm only interested in transparency." The word landed harder than any threat. Within days, documents began to surface. Not leaked, circulated. Nothing illegal. Nothing dramatic. Just enough truth to shift leverage. The messages stopped. The articles faded. Fear changed hands. That night, standing by the window, Nathaniel asked quietly, "Are you ready for what comes next?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said. Because this ends now. What I didn't say was that endings always cost something. The collapse didn't come with headlines. It never does. It happened quietly, through postponed deals, sudden resignations, and partnerships that dissolved without explanation. Men who once moved markets with a phone call suddenly became cautious, because caution is what remains when certainty disappears. The pressure on me vanished as abruptly as it had arrived. No more messages. No more warnings disguised as advice. Fear had found a new direction. One evening, weeks later, Nathaniel and I stood on the terrace overlooking the city. The noise below felt distant, like something we'd survived rather than belonged to. It's finished, he said. For them, I replied. He turned toward me. You could stay. Make this permanent. The offer was real this time. No strategy. No performance. I thought about the woman I'd been before all of this, quiet, careful, convinced that survival meant staying invisible. She wouldn't have recognized me now. I don't want to be protected, I said softly. I want to be chosen for who I am. Nathaniel nodded. Then go. There was no argument. No resentment. Respect doesn't beg. Months later, my life looked nothing like the one I'd walked away from. I built something of my own. Small at first. Honest. Untouchable. Sometimes I saw Nathaniel's name in the news. Sometimes I didn't. But when I thought of him, it wasn't with regret, it was with clarity. Because I hadn't gained a powerful man. I had gained myself. And once you learn how power actually works, no one can ever make you feel small again.